Good afternoon, everyone. It is finally afternoon, I believe, and welcome to our third in our seminar series. Great pleasure to have you all here. It's a terrific roll-up. Thank you all for coming. Introduce myself, I guess. I'm Ashley Eakins, for those of you who don't know me, the head of the military history section here. I'd especially like to welcome I think we have one member of the Army History Unit who was able to make it. The others are in Sydney at the moment, I hope. And Strategic Defence Studies Centre at ANU, University of New South Wales, ADFA, the Western Front Association, I think, and of course War Memorial staff, volunteers, voluntary guides, and our ever valuable friends of the memorial. Thank you all for coming. Could I ask you all, please, if you have mobile phones, to turn them off now or to silence? Always have to remind people. There will be a question period at the end after Malia's talk, and we'll have microphones on either side, which will be brought to you if you put your hand up. And please just announce yourself, introduce yourself, stand and ask your question. These seminars are being held every 2 months, perhaps more by chance than design, but that's the intention for the future anyway. Some of you might recall our earlier presentation, the first by Professor Gary Sheffield in January this year, on the role and reputation of General Douglas Haig, on which Gary has done a great amount of work, and there'll be more forthcoming. Britain's Supreme Commander, of course, on the Western Front. And then there was a fine presentation in March by our military history section colleague, Aaron Pegram, on some of the findings of his original and, I think, groundbreaking work into Australian prisoners of the Germans on the Western Front. So today we're continuing with this Western Front theme with a presentation by another military history section colleague, Malia Hampton, on her study into military operations on the Western Front, notably in the, I believe, notorious Battle of Mouquet Farm and the Somme in 1916. And I thought it's particularly timely to mention that it's appropriate that we consider the Somme here today. 97 years ago, in late July 1916, the week-long preparatory artillery bombardment that heralded the Battle of the Somme was reaching its crescendo. The figures are almost unimaginable. Over 1 million shells were hurled by over 1,400 Allied guns from the British and French front lines onto the German-held positions. Opposite them, some 12,000 tonnes of steel that was intended to crush and subdue the opposition. Next Monday, the 1st of July, will mark that 97th anniversary of the moment just after dawn when this horrendous artillery bombardment ceased at 0 hour. It's said by some who were there that the birds began to sing again. Allied troops, 13 British divisions and 11 French divisions, went over the top to what they were assured would be an instant victory to attack the German lines. The result was the greatest catastrophe in British military history. 60,000 British casualties, 20,000 of them dead, killed or died of wounds in a single day. And that summer's day was just the start of the long Somme campaign that was to continue until winter brought a halt to the massive slaughter on both sides. A total of about 1 million men, 4.5 months later, in mid-November. The Battle of the Somme and those pervasive images of its horror and carnage came to characterise the Great War in our popular myth and memory. It's well to remember too that next Monday, the 1st of July, commemorative services will be attended by thousands of descendants of those soldiers at a dozen major sites like Thiepval, Newfoundland Memorial Park, Ulster Tower and Lochnagar Crater, La Boisselle, and many others, as they have in the memory of that first terrible day for almost a century now. They will stand on ground, those people attending, that will continue to produce its annual iron harvest of shells and human clay for at least another century as a tangible reminder of the cost and enduring impact of the Great War. The costs, the outcome and the purpose of the Battle of the Somme have been examined and debated by politicians and commanders responsible, soldiers, and of course historians, always historians, ever since. Today, Malia will lead us into the role in battle of the poor bloody infantryman. And I expect from the work she's been doing, reshape some of our perceptions based on this exciting study she's been undertaking on the pivotal battle for Mouquet Farm in August of 1916. A quick word on Malia. She's one of the newest members of our military history section and has quickly become a valued addition, an asset I should say, to our team. She and her work have been known to us though for some time. She shone as a Memorial Summer Scholar in 2008 when she applied her research skills and writing talents to a study of the American soldiers on the Western Front for a work she later presented at the Memorials History Conference in November that year, and which you can read in that very fine book, 1918 Year of Victory, available at all good bookshops, as they say, and of course, including our excellent bookshop upstairs. Her current work is a major doctoral study that she's completing into military operations in 1916 under the supervision of Professor Robin Pryor, who many of you will know, at the University of Adelaide. So I ask you please to welcome Malia to talk to us today on what the infantry did in the battles of Pozieres and Mouquet Farm. Thanks, Malia.
Hiya, thank you very much for being here. I'm really pleased to be talking to you about this, and I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for making me feel so welcome here. It's a real privilege to work for the Memorial, and especially at the time leading into all of these commemorative events coming up. Next week is also a significant anniversary for some of the later battles in the war. It's the 95th anniversary of the Battle of Hamel on Thursday of next week. That particular battle was famous for its place as one of the earliest examples of really well-engineered, successful First World War battle. It was conducted by the infantry of the Australian Corps, famously under command of John Monash, and was so well executed that it ran just 3 minutes over the timetabled 90 minutes. One of the things that makes this battle so significant is the way that all of the arms available to the Australian Corps were integrated and worked together. The battle was framed by artillery, which was successful in taking out all of the German artillery battles in the area, as well as in firing a creeping barrage that the infantry could follow closely and work within. Tanks worked with the infantry under the barrage and answered flag signals telling them to come and get rid of German strong points. And aircraft were used for reconnaissance, as well as to mask the sound of the arrival of the tanks and to supply forward troops with ammunition and food for the first time ever in battle. This interlocking nature of weaponry on the battlefield is something that really comes to the fore in 1918, although the Battle of Cambrai in 1917 seriously foreshadows what was to come. 1918 may seem an unusual place to start a discussion of the role of the infantry in the field in 1916, but it really defines a problem in the approach to studies of the infantry that's gaining prominence in First World War studies. And Hamel, or even Cambrai, does not necessarily mark the beginning of well-structured, firepower-dependent battles. The story of Hamel certainly defines and describes the critical role technology had to play on the First World War battlefield. Artillery and heavy firepower form the backbone of the operations, and then air power, trench mortars, infantry signals, and all the other myriad components fill in the space around it. But what's important to note is that the infantry are a part of this. They're not just bystanders, but they're a weapon in this systemised application of firepower. So much of the way we've talked about infantry in the past comes from two perspectives. One is the bottom-up perspective, which encompasses works that study the experience of war and the poor bloody infantry who fought it. It begins with the soldier in the field, and it ends with the soldier in the field, more or less. Research in this field has given us valuable insights into the experience of fighting the war, but it limits our understanding of the military conduct of the war itself. Australian poet and novelist Frederick Manning, who fought with the British Army, tells us that the soldier, I quote, neither knew where he was nor whither he was going. He could have no plan because he could foresee nothing, though his movements had to conform to those of others spontaneously as part of some infinitely flexible plan, which he could not comprehend very clearly even in regard to its immediate object. In-battle experiences tell us what happened to a person, but not necessarily how or why they happened. The other way we talk about infantry is from a top-down perspective, in which we look at large bodies of men, and a battalion could be as big as 1,000 men, to explain what happened on a battlefield. In many respects, this approach gives us more insight into the military conduct of the war. It's a method of studying conflict that seeks to address questions of command and control through a battle analysis of battles. And because of the vast scale of the First World War, it's easier to discuss a battalion moving around a field rather than a platoon moving around a field in order to understand further the larger picture. And so often in First World War studies, this sort of discussion is centred on the role of the commander of the British forces, Sir Douglas Haig. I should say there's nothing wrong with either of these approaches, but they're not the only two approaches that are available to us. It's neither is particularly good way to approach the current pressing issue in First World War studies either, which is how did this integrated engineered battle model that we first see at Hamel arise? My contention, on which I am hanging many PhD hopes and dreams, is that we need to look at a level of operation that's between these top-down and bottom-up approaches to really thoroughly investigate the theory of a learning curve or a learning process. And a fascinating byproduct of this has been a better understanding of the capacity in the field of your average infantryman. The infantry is a weapon and it has a place, so let's have a look. Perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not, the most basic elements of the Hamel battle are present in the battle plans of 1st Anzac Corps at Pozières on the 23rd of July 1916. This battle is integrally based on the cooperation of arms, with the artillery forming the backbone to the assault plan. There are fewer arms available, the artillery is not as good at hitting things, there's no tanks, and battalions are allocated no more than 4 machine guns each. But what there is put into an organised structure. This structure actually comes from Reserve Army, born of the experience of the British Army on the Western Front in the preceding 18 months of the year. And it looks like this. It looks like an amazing slide. The basic plan was for the infantry waves to follow a lifting artillery barrage. This is why there's a slide. It's really hard to explain. The infantry start from a position of depth, 3 lines of infantry like this. After the artillery fires a preliminary barrage on the objectives to soften up the defences, it drops a line of fire on the first objective here. It stays there for a period of time and then it lifts to the second objective, and as it does so, the first line of infantry take the first objective. As the artillery lifts from the second to the third objective, the second line of infantry follows through, leaving the first line behind to consolidate what they've taken. Then the artillery lifts again, and the third line of infantry comes through and stays on the third objective and stays there to consolidate where they are, while the artillery barrage stays up there to protect them from oncoming counterattacks or any sort of infantry reinforcement. What's really important to notice here is the depth. The deep sort of defences have moved up, turned themselves inside out, and maintain a depth in advance. If we apply this to a map of Pozières, it's a little bit more diagonal, but it looks like this. The first objective is here, then the second objective, third objective, and this is where the final standing barrage was to sit, while the infantry are consolidating their gains along the road. This is the plan that General Sir Hubert Gough, as Army Commander, decreed and passed on to Lieutenant General William Birdwood, who, as Corps Commander, passed that on to the 1st Australian Division, who would make the actual assault. The fire plan has to work for the infantry to be able to function, which will become more clear later. Many things can go wrong with an artillery plan. The preliminary bombardment might be too weak, the artillery lifts might be too short, they might move too far, they might be the wrong kind, too much high explosive, not enough high explosive, the shells might be duds, the guns might not be ranged correctly. There are myriad things that can go wrong. But let's talk about when things do go right. And what happens is that the heavier forms of firepower create a net within which the infantry has room to manoeuvre and influence things. Fortunately for us, the artillery barrage works very well on the first day at Pozières. The guns are well ranged, the lifting barrage is delivered effectively and on time, and so we can use this to study what the infantry is able to do. 2 Australian brigades attack the village of Pozières. The first on the left and the third on the right, with the boundary, that's the aspect of the boundary. I want to talk about the left of the line first. Here, Brigadier General Neville Maskelyne Smythe, the officer commanding the 1st Brigade, took the plan I've just described, as delivered by 1st Anzac Corps, and applied it in a straightforward manner. The 2nd and 1st Battalions would supply the first 2 waves of the attack, and the 4th and 3rd Battalions, respectively, would supply following waves to leapfrog through. Smythe's brigade divided the line into 2 basic sectors and put half a battalion into each wave, including a 4th wave as reserve. This way, the way this would work in the field was that the commander of the 1st Battalion, the 2nd or the 1st, would retain control of the sector as the waves from behind, from the 4th and 3rd, would come through. But how this worked in practice was a matter of personality and individual relationships. On the left, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Borlase Stevens, the officer commanding the 2nd Battalion, was designated sector commander over Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Gifford Mackay's 4th Battalion waves. But Mackay didn't work in conjunction with Stevens at all, even bypassing Stevens' headquarters when sending messages. Stevens has little more he can do than impotently complain that you can see it there, nothing further can be obtained, nor has any attempt been made to keep in touch with me. Notice at the bottom, rather than tell 3rd Brigade headquarters to try to contact Mackay, the other battalion commander in his sector, Stevens tells them to contact the officer commanding the 3rd Battalion, the next sector over. Mackay had deliberately steamrolled Stevens as this battalion came through and effectively cut him out of what should have been his role in commanding the extreme left of the line at Pozières. Stevens probably knew it, although I can't truly decide if he's trying his own method of cutting Mackay out of events with this message, or if he actually thinks the attack has failed and Mackay is far behind his battalion or worse. I think probably the first, though. What matters, though, is that the 2 failed to work together. There's no cooperation, and the individuals tore their attack apart somewhat. On the right flank of 1st Brigade sector, to compare, the situation was completely different, and it demonstrates how well this command arrangement could actually work. The commanders were Lieutenant Colonel James Heen, commanding the 1st Battalion, and therefore the first 2 lines of the attack and the sector by association, and Lieutenant Colonel Owen Glendower Howell Price, beautifully named Welshman, commanding the 3rd Battalion, who would follow the 3rd and possible 4th lines. These 2 commanders worked closely together and in fact shared headquarters, which they weren't obliged to do. Early in the battle, the 1st Battalion was having problems receiving information as to troop locations and the position of their front line. As a battalion commander, Heen could be expected to stay in his headquarters as a central location to receive messages and issue orders. But instead, he took control of the situation by gathering a group of bombers, staff and signallers to go to the front line and find out the situation for himself. To do this, he left the 3rd Battalion Commander Howell Price at battalion headquarters with the remainder of his staff and Howell Price's own staff to exercise sector command. But on his return, Howell Price gave it back to Heen. The difference between these 2 sectors is marked. If we look at the line gained by the 24th of July, you can see what happens. While both sectors gained their objectives and more, the 1st and 3rd Battalions operating together were more organised and prepared to take advantage of the situation to push forward into the village itself, and they're responsible for that most advanced red line that is straddling the boundary there. The 4th Battalion, though, which has left the 2nd behind, holds its objective, tags some gains onto what's happened with the 1st and 3rd Battalions, but is not strong enough to get any further and maintain a cohesive line. The action of Heen and Howell Price show individual initiative at battalion level. This is still a significant level of command, and men of lower rank also had scope to act in unplanned ways. Before the attack even began, a platoon of the 2nd Battalion had been conducting patrols north of the Albert Bapaume Road, which is a diagonal road through the middle of the village. They had managed to eject a German patrol from some old gun pits and had established an advanced position about here on the map. This unscheduled advance had mixed results. They stayed there as the advance went ahead, and their fire helped to protect the flank of the 2nd Battalion as they rushed the German strongpoint Gibraltar, which is about there, at the southwest end of the village. But their situation was too far forward and unsupported, and also directly in the path of the scheduled artillery barrage. And as that came through, they had to be withdrawn around about the 3rd lift of the barrage. In reports, this is actually attributed to the barrage from the heavy guns firing falling short onto the platoon, rather than the fact that the platoon was miles away from where it should have been. And the record doesn't show which company they came from either, or under whose authority they advanced to where they did. But it is most likely that individual initiative led the group departing from the plan and to them acting alone. And it's not just in the infantry that this sort of thing was happening. Before the artillery began, an artillery officer at the extreme left of the line pushed forward his 18-pounder gun to a position from the head of the Sausage Valley, which is down off the map here, to a position roughly here on the Bapaume Road. This man, Lieutenant Thornhill, and his crew then fired 115 rounds starting at 0 hour, which blasted along the road like this. It enfiladed the main road and provides an ongoing horizontal barrage behind which the infantry can work without risk of having German defenders cross the road. It seems that the appearance of this gun was so unusual that the Germans didn't manage to stop it, and it was later withdrawn to a crater without casualty. Despite the fact that this was completely outside of the artillery firing plan, this act seems to have been somewhat effective, and it certainly earned Thornhill and his crew nothing but admiration. But it did reduce the ability of his battery to fire according to the fire plan, and that, if this sort of situation had been allowed to continue, would have caused much more serious problems as fire plan is developed and applied. These smaller acts of initiative occurred outside of the plan and failed to maintain the structure and cohesion of the operation as laid out in the original orders. These two examples of personal initiative contradict the action of Heen and his initiative in combining headquarters and sharing power with Howell Price. Heen took the initiative to strengthen his front line, provide accurate situation reports to brigade, and create a solid base of information on which to plan the next move of his battalion. But although these are brave acts by well-intentioned men, these cowboy operations run the risk of seriously endangering both the operation and lives unnecessarily by taking people from where they should be, putting them somewhere that's awesome but not useful. Their contribution, if anything, was probably accidental. This shouldn't be taken, though, as evidence that individuals below the rank of Lieutenant Colonel had no hope of affecting the outcome of battle in the right circumstances. On the right, where the 3rd Brigade faced an already difficult situation, a small number of individuals, in my opinion, acted in ways that changed the outcome of the 1st Australian Corps' attack on the village of Pozières and why we remember it as a success. The nature of the task facing the 3rd Brigade is tied up with one of the main problems with my beautiful lifting barrage slide. At Pozières, the forming up lines weren't nicely stacked one behind the other, as they were on the movement. They actually had to filter into the battlefield along this arrow. There was a border over here with 4th Army, which couldn't be crossed for mostly reasons of traffic. And there's Sausage and Mash Valleys up here where they filtered up into the battlefield and then made this turn. And this is the extent of, as far as they're moving across, these are the OG lines. And so they've got to make their way along here in the dark, under fire, along shell-torn, featureless grounds, even to just get to the point where they're supposed to start from. This was a considerable impediment to success, And the difficulty was in fact augmented by the brigade commander, Brigadier General Ewan Sinclair McLagan, and his rather intricate plan. Instead of offering this straightforward interpretation of army orders like Smythe did, Sinclair McLagan split each line of infantry into further waves. And then each of these waves was designed to attack objectives they didn't obviously belong to. For example, a wave belonging to the third line of infantry might be assigned to attack the second objective. These are brigade orders, which won't help at all. The 5th Brigade here, if you have a look, should be from the first line of infantry from the 2nd Battalion. So who's their commander? They either go forward and reinforce the battalion ahead of them when their battalion commander's planning to do stuff with them behind. Do they stay behind when the front battalion desperately needs reinforcement? There's no clear delineation of whose plan this is. What's going on in 1st Brigade with the battalion commanders sharing and allocating sectors is informal, and it's not actually decreed. It's something they worked out themselves. So the fact that there's not even that level of informality going on here is worse. The confusion means that a map and a pencil are essential to decipher who should be where when, and as someone who's used a map and a pencil to decipher this, it doesn't help. When combined with the arduous entry into the field of operations, this level of detailed movements of small units of infantry contributed to a widespread disintegration of formation, either before or immediately after 0 hour. And some level of confusion is to be expected as an operation is launched, but here the units are muddled to such a degree that the attack is in danger of failing. It must be said, for example, that I can't find any large-scale presence of the 9th Battalion in the field at all. But given the accuracy of the artillery barrage, even in the confusion and muddle of this battlefield, individuals could make their presence felt, perhaps even more so. The far right of the line saw remarkable feats of bravery. Lieutenant Arthur Blackburn of the 10th Battalion found his progress blocked by German strongpoints in the OG lines, and his actions won him a VC. His citation reads, "By dogged determination, he eventually captured their trench after personally leading 4 separate parties of bombers against it, many of whom became casualties. In the face of fierce opposition, he captured 250 yards of trench. Then, after crawling forward with a sergeant to reconnoitre, he turned, attacked and seized another 120 yards of trench, establishing communication with the battalion on his left." Arthur Blackburn performed incredible feats of bravery up here, roughly up here I expect, to reduce the threat from a German strong point, and is a really important act in moving the line forward. But I would contend that his action in establishing communication with the battalion on his left is as important, if not more so. Because if the line doesn't advance as far as intended, that's a problem. But if the line breaks, there's a potential for serious disaster. And in fact, there is a possibility that the line here was endangering, that the advance up here was endangering the general operation of the centre of the line by being too disconnected or even too far forward. This green section is a part of the line I'd like to talk about, and is what is the problem. Between Blackburn's party in the OG line and the centre of the right flank, a large gap started to appear in the line as the attack wore on. This was the result of a number of events. Firstly, many men in the first wave of infantry didn't stop on their objective and consolidate it. Instead, they carried on as a second wave of infantry came through and took off into the village, and there's reports of them chasing Germans through the streets and ducking into buildings and cellars. Furthermore, the coordinated units of the 11th Battalion tended to pull to the left into the more organised sector of Heen and Howell Price, which is how you get a small section of their sector making the same advance as the 1st and 3rd Battalion. And finally, a significant portion of the 9th Battalion went missing, and only remnants remained to join organised platoons of the 10th, 11th and 12th Battalions. All of these things can be attributed to simple inexperience, and it's a hallmark of early battles of any formation on the Western Front. They will disappear from Australian actions very quickly. But here and now, this gap seriously threatened the success of operations. And it's not a small gap. It is better described as a battalion-sized hole. And it's more or less opposite a significant German garrison in Mouquet Farm. The map I showed you just there is from a situation map held by 1st Anzac for the 24th of July. And the part in green, circled in green, is from what I can tell from individual situation reports, a complete fabrication. It's probably born of the 9th Battalion's brief report in their war diary that they arrived at the objective and began digging in with no specifics attached, which would be because there were no specifics to attach, just lost. This gap was blocked by the work of just a few individuals, the most significant of which was Captain Ferdinand George Medcalf of the 11th Battalion. Medcalf had been put in command at the last minute following a casualty and had been given control of one of the leading waves attacking the first objective. But although many of his men rushed on towards the second objective instead of saying to consolidate their own goal, Medcalf stayed and with 30 or 40 men organised consolidation of a small portion of line about there. At this stage, it seemed like, particularly to brigade headquarters, this would have seemed like the only line they had. The situation was so bad. But after he'd done this, he had word of a group of 400 men of various units establishing a line further forward about here. So Medcalf left someone in control of his original point and moved forward to take command of the next one. He then established communication with one other officer of the 11th Battalion, Captain Louis Leon Lenné, which is so alliterative, it hurts. He had also established a strong post up here, about half a mile in front of the jumping off point, and was reorganising muddled units into a cohesive force. Lenné attempted to send situation reports to battalion headquarters and both went on and ordered a number of reconnaissance patrols, although he never established direct lines of communication with brigade and relied on Medcalf's post to get messages back. Medcalf also made reconnaissance patrols, going out himself with a specific view of getting enough information to send battalion headquarters accurate situation reports. He established successful communication with headquarters and began to receive information from them in return. In fact, it would seem that for some hours after 5 a.m, Medcalf served as the primary conduit for messages to and from the front line in his sector. Most often they were personally addressed to him, which is somewhat remarkable given his unofficial capacity that he was serving in. The importance of these actions cannot be overestimated, because without them, the line would not even have been in the tenuous state it was, and the attackers would have been forced to return to their original lines or worse. What's important to note here is that neither man was specifically ordered to behave as he did, but each took the initiative to act in accordance with the pre-established structure of the operation and according to accepted military principles. By understanding what needed to be done and ways of doing it, a single man could prevent the collapse of an entire operation. This is actually a principle that becomes more and more integral to the Australian method of doing things on the battlefield. Most of us are probably somewhat familiar with the pictures of mock-ups of the Messine battlefield, in which all ranks of infantry came along and had a look to see exactly what they needed to do and when and how it would happen. The more men you've got who are familiar with the plan, the more people you've got in the field with the knowledge needed to act in accordance with the plan and with the structured firepower interwoven through the plan. In 1918, only the most willfully ignorant soldier could claim that he neither knew where he was nor whither he was going, as Frederick Manning said. But before this principle was even instilled in the Australian infantry, Medcalf and Lenné took individual action outside of their orders to stop the 3rd Brigade sector crumbling apart. Although the job was much more difficult on their end of the line, and made even more so by their brigade commander's somewhat ridiculous plan, the brigade made gains and they held on to them, which is an important distinction between what happened here and what happens next. The immediate priority following the capture and consolidation of Pozières village was to ensure control of the OG lines, where they continued to the northeast of Pozières here. By the time they were ready to do so, the relevant portion of the Australian line is the red piece, and they wanted to attack the OG lines in the green piece. The 2nd Australian Division, after relieving the 1st, attacked these lines on the night of the 28th of July. Their operation began with the same structure as that of the 1st Brigade, a lifting artillery barrage, followed by lines of infantry. As I said, this is a staple feature of operations at the time, but it doesn't mean that that's immutable law in its actual form. In fact, there was quite a wide latitude for tinkering with this basic plan, and the commander of the 2nd Australian Division, Major General James Gordon Legge, took as much leeway as he was given. Unfortunately, he does not seem to have had a solid grasp of the reasons why this technology-driven approach to battle had come about, and so his tinkering was at best not effective and at worst a complete disaster. This operation is slightly different in that at this time there are just 2 objectives, OG1 and OG2, and they're very close together. Legge's first option seems to have been to dispose of the artillery barrage altogether, but Birdwood caught wind of it and stopped it. But his infantry plan doesn't mirror 1st Division's approach either. With one less line of objectives to attack, you might expect him to use less infantry in the operation, so just 2 lines. Instead, he used more infantry to get the job done by combining infantry lines, so that double the amount of infantry would attack each objective compared to 1st Division's plan. Compounding the problem, each battalion had about 50 yards less frontage, so the attacking lines were very thickly populated with infantry indeed, which doesn't necessarily cause the operation to fail, although it is a major factor in the extremely high casualties suffered by the 2nd Division in this, and it must be said, subsequent attacks. But there is a bigger problem with the poor use of artillery here. To begin with, the preparatory bombardment was really unsatisfactory. The operation was rushed through by Legge at Gough's behest, and there were significant problems with the ability to observe the fall of shot and with ascertaining the state of the German barbed wire defences the bombardment was supposed to destroy. The barrage lifts were also completely inadequate, resting on each objective for just 3 minutes before lifting onto the next, until finally standing more than 200 yards away from the final objective. Failure to rely closely on heavily applied firepower is the primary cause of failure of this operation. The barbed wire, although as you can see here was considerably damaged by the preliminary bombardment, it wasn't broken, and it remains a formidable barrier to an infantry advance. The heavily populated infantry lines were seen by German defenders as they moved into place in the battlefield, partly because there was simply too many of them to fit into the prepared jumping-off trench, and partly because the weak and swift-lifting artillery barrage did nothing to keep the Germans in their trenches. They were ready and waiting on their machine guns at 0 hour. And so the kind of individual initiative that had been able to have such dramatic consequences in saving the attack on Pozières could have no effect here. I would love to be talking to you in detail about the action of men like Lieutenant Victor Thomas Symes Worry, a company commander of the 25th Battalion, who was commended for bravery in leading his men to a gap in the wire and standing in the open to direct men through. There were others in this battalion too, like his fellow company commander, Lieutenant John Lyle Smith, who managed to find the other of the 2 narrow gaps in the wire before pausing there to direct his men into it. There were platoon commanders, 2nd Lieutenant Louis Walter Tietzel, 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Joseph Carey, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Stewart O'Hay, 2nd Lieutenant Aaron McIntyre, and Lieutenant James Monteagle Brown, who were all mentioned in dispatches and quoting from their citation for their great gallantry in leading their platoons on the night of 28-29th July in the attack on Pozières Ridge, with particular note that they were seen organising the men as much as possible and encouraging them on. This is exactly what Metcalfe and Lannes had done so effectively for the 3rd Brigade only days previously, but with one important difference. At the end of the attack, every single one of those men was dead. Individual initiative and attention to organisation simply could not function in battle on the Western Front outside of a framework of carefully applied firepower. Without cut wire and an effective protective barrage, all of the bravery and initiative in the world could not protect an infantryman from alert defenders and accurate machine gun fire. This image is from the Reserve Army's war diary recording this attack. It features some rather remarkable exaggerations. The left of the brigade did reach its objective, but it was part of the attack I didn't show you and was not aimed at the OG lines, and only a very small portion retained their position. And as for the statement that our casualties were not heavy, I probably beg to differ. Pozières, and in particular the subsequent fighting at Mouquet Farm, show us that what happened on the Western Front was anything but a straightforward process of incremental improvements. In fact, the situation in 1st Anzac Corps' sector of operations deteriorated from here on in. Rather than look at what caused the success at Pozières on the 23rd of July, commanders allowed themselves to be distracted by smaller and smaller objectives. And so instead of planning 500 or 600 yard advances, which we saw at the village, they concentrated on German strong points and defences really close to the Australian line. The most serious of the German defences in the area, Mouquet Farm, was never the subject of a direct attack by Australians. The bigger picture really becomes lost, and this is the main reason we end up talking about point 86 or point 27 at Mouquet Farm. You would be hard-pressed to find those points if you went to the Somme today without linesmen and a beautiful GPS, because they're simply not significant outside of the context of July and August 1916. And all this is the crux of the problem on the Western Front. The way in which the infantry and the artillery had to work together to advance the Allied line was unprecedented, and learning how to do it effectively was much more complex than even what I've been talking about today. This complexity seems to really have obscured some of the most important principles of an effective attack on the Western Front for some time, which is demonstrated by the fact that one of the earliest and best examples, Hamel, doesn't take place until July 1918. And the role of the infantry and the individual is even more problematic, because what they relied on so much to go right was outside of their level of control. A good artillery plan, an accurately fired good artillery plan, which is different, or even a well-interpreted and applied plan from their brigade commander, all makes a difference to what one man can do. You may be surprised to know that war is not about killing straight up. It's about territorial control. You can do it most effectively through killing the other side, but taking prisoners or even making people move out of an area with gas or artillery fire will do it. In order to take control of territory, very large groups of men had to work together to achieve their goal. Individuals who directly contributed to that overarching corporate action had the best chance of contributing to an overall success and could make a difference at almost any level of rank. What I want to leave you with today is a sense of structure in battle. Warfare in the First World War is never really the muddy melee that you often get the impression of, but it's a combined effort of men, and it's a masterpiece of coordination. Thank you very much.
I think you'll all agree that was a masterpiece of clarity in exposition. It really was. And if it's an example, Malia, of what the final work will be, I think many of us will be buying the book. So good luck with the thesis. Are there any questions about the use of this weapon, as Malia called it, the poor infantryman who could be squandered so recklessly or could be used to great effect with their initiative and their skill? Questions, please. We have mics if you'd like to put your hand up. Down here. Clem.
Did the Australian Corps actually look at these battles afterwards to see what they could have learnt for the next one?
That's a really interesting question, because all the way through this process they're doing it. For example, after the 2nd Division's first attack on the OG lines, a whole bunch of recommendations flood upwards. And what the most significant of those is about the thickly populated infantry lines, which Legg himself wrote in a report saying, yes, we mustn't populate our infantry lines too heavily, and then proceeds to make it worse the next time he does it. So there's a dichotomy between understanding what's going on and applying it at the same time. And it's something to keep an eye out as I keep moving through, is to when the big lessons that they are clearly demonstrating they understand actually show up in their practical application in the battlefield, because there's no relation to what they know and what they're doing in most cases so far.
Sorry, can you make the link then with Messine? Because you said at Messine they were starting to walk them through, so that was sort of, that's 1917, so they're starting to learn.
Yeah. What's happening is, especially in these 1916 battles, they're really realising that a lot of their casualties are officers. Like these fellas who are standing in the wire directing men are putting themselves in the line of fire. And a primary problem is they're not having anybody else know to pick up the map and the orders and carry on in leadership. I'm not sure at what point they really twigged to that being a problem. It's going to be sometime after Bullecourt in early 1917, but they really start to function on this thing where officers lead but everybody knows. And it's particularly evident later in the war, much later in the war, when the Australians are working with the Americans, who have conscripted their army from their lowest socioeconomic ranks, and these people can't read. They can't read the time, they can't read maps, they can't read orders, and so they can't take up where an officer's left off. So somewhere between early 1917 and late 1917, someone twigs that everybody needs to know.
In your analysis of the effectiveness of these battles, how much are you able to take into account of German strengths in various positions, their tactics and their strategies as a factor in that effectiveness?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because the Germans are doing a wide variety of things, and they all work. So 2 crossed machine guns crossing their fire can stop a company of men really comfortably. So anything they do above that is going to work. So as long as they've got established lines, most of these, like the Pozières ones, are concreted in by this stage. So anything they do is going to work. And it's not until later that their defences start to matter. The basic problem on the Western Front is the overwhelming supremacy of defence. And so this is sort of an example of how that works out. And their attack practices are bizarre as well. There's stories of Germans counter-attacking with 10 rows of 10 men each, a yard apart in a grid, walking across the battlefield, which just seems crazy. But then that never appears again. So there's a wide scope for studying German practices on the Western Front too.
How much did the prevailing ethos that if you weren't sustaining huge casualties, you weren't trying hard enough, influence the commander's decisions?
It's less that the casualties are a sign of things going ahead, and more general impatience on the part of Gough to just be doing something. So he sort of has a principle where he will design the big things, but if he's not doing big things, do little things and carry on. So there's a real push to keep the army commander happy, because he is popping into headquarters at all levels and visiting people and pestering them, not really coordinating things. And so they persist in attacks even when they aren't given large-scale objectives. And that is one of the primary causes of the huge casualty count of Australians at Pozières and Mouquet Farm. They're not setting up large-scale attacks on a broad front where they've got flanks and flanks and flanks to protect each other. They're just trying to get that German strong point there. Oh, I can't organise artillery, we don't have enough time, we'll take a trench mortar, that'll do. And it's too ad hoc for what is required.
Hi, Malia. Thanks. That was very good. I hope you'll indulge me with two questions. The first, you've mentioned quite a bit about German machine guns, and you also mentioned the British fire planning around the advance. I'm wondering about German artillery fire and what the British fire planning was, or Australian fire planning was, for counter-battery fire. And secondly, I'm wondering how much of what the Australians are going through here reflects what the wider BEF is doing.
They are great questions. The Germans have been here for ages, and they have their guns ranged to the millimetre, so they can accurately pour shell fire onto the village and onto massing infantry once they get to within cooey of the road. So as the attack goes forward, the German artillery is a huge problem and is responsible for many, many casualties. And it's because they are accurate. The Australian guns are not great. I was interested to see that they're using flash spotting to try and identify where the German batteries are, which is a method of looking for flashes of guns from several angles and then trying to triangulate to see where to hit. They can't hit anything though, because their guns are not well calibrated, and the barrels are wearing even as early as the first week, so they tend to fling shells too far. So the German artillery is very rarely taken out. They take out occasional ammunition dumps is probably the best they get. But the Germans at the same time, while occasionally they seem to be applying a sort of barrage protection to counterattacks, are more likely to just pour fire onto the village and try and disrupt mid to back lines instead. As far as this being representative of what else is happening on the Somme, it is absolutely representative, and I think this sort of thing needs to be done for all sorts of battles, because if you think about Longueval, Delville Wood, Chepval, any of these things, they're battles that seem to start okay, good core, and they quickly deteriorate, and then they're pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And that's what happens here. And for reasons that I've described about command evolving lower in the field, and so people can only see the main objective being that gun over there. And I think that is an exemplar for the whole line, but I think we need to do more study to work that out.
Question down here.
Look, it's probably more a comment. I don't know if you've spoken to Bob Stevenson with his book on the 1st Division.
No, I have
look,
not.
he actually talks about quite a bit about this whole learning system across the Western Front, and he's out at ADFA at the moment working on the volume on the Western Front on the centenary history of the war. I think it'd be quite interesting for you to talk together, because he covers. He's looking at the division as a system, but he covers many of the same points.
Yeah, that'd be great. I've not read his stuff, but
No, his books, I'm pretty sure it's not the book he wanted to write. It's been cut down a bit, but he looks at many of the same questions, and at these two battles as the first, or the first one, and particularly as the first battle on the Western Front of the 1st Division.
it's a really important example, I think, because I've grown up with an image of the Australian infantryman as walking in and saving the day and taking Pozières, even though the British couldn't. And it's so much more nuanced than that. And these people really don't know what they're doing. And that's okay, because this is not a precedented situation. And a lot of the problems you see here are a lot of the problems that cause huge amounts of disaster at Fromelles. That's okay, because they don't know what they're doing either. They're trying really hard to pick up a really unprecedented situation. So,
I think in the absence of further questions, and it being pretty close to 1 o'clock, we might bring it to a close. No further questions? No? Well, look, please join me in thanking Malia for a brilliant